Thank you so much, Rob. Welcome to the Eiffel stage here at Change Now.
Thank you. Hello.
This
Lovely
session
to see you.
and closing part of our session here on sustainable and resilient cities. You're an expert, in fact, and you've written about the transition town networks. We've got lots of concrete examples that I'm going to be asking you about as to how we can empower citizens to build resilience at a local level. Okay. But first of all, I want to ask you who you are. Can you tell us a little bit about you and how you came on this journey? Not, I don't mean physically to this stage here today, but the journey that you've taken to become an expert in citizen resilience.
Well, hello everybody. I think the first thing I feel very underdressed. I think the mayor of Turku has set a beautiful example in terms of I long to live in a future where more mayors have shoes like that. It's fantastic. Respect. How did I don't know, by accident really, I think. I was a permaculture teacher for quite a long time, and I worked with communities and groups and teaching people permaculture, and I would teach people natural building, how to build straw bale buildings and cob buildings and things like this. And I lived in Ireland for 10 years and I was doing that work. And in 2005, when I moved back to the UK, I met some people and we started this conversation about, well, what might a community-led response to the climate emergency look like? And we were really just trying to figure something out that might work in our town. And very quickly, people were getting in touch with us from all over the place saying, what are you doing? How is this? What is this transition thing? We hadn't written a book or done anything. I remember a really important moment. This was when YouTube was quite a new thing. If some of you younger might not be able to imagine that, but there was a time when YouTube was quite a new thing, and someone showed me a video from New Zealand of a woman in her hall in her village giving a presentation about transition. I'd never spoken to her, didn't know who she was, and she was fantastic. And it was really interesting to see that spreading. So now the transition movement is in 50 countries, in thousands of places. It's bottom up, it spreads in a really beautifully self-organized kind of way. And my role really has been to try and support that and kind of connect it together and to tell its stories, I think. As much as anything, it's a movement of stories around the world.
Very much so, and you've shared many of those in your books also.
Yeah.
Very popular and a very good read. So, Rob, one of the words that I've been using here all day this afternoon and is in the title of this session is the word resilience. And what is resilience exactly? And why talk about it with communities? How can communities support resilience?
There's a football manager in the UK called Ian Dowie who once described resilience as bounce back ability. And for me, it's that ability to move with shocks that you encounter and not just completely unravel and fall apart. And I was reading today that actually the French Environment Minister has announced that they're creating a plan for how France can adapt to a 4-degree rise in temperature. France can't adapt to a 4-degree rise in temperature. It's completely insane. It's already 1.2 degrees. Last summer, 100 towns ran out of water and crops failed. If you get to 1.8, 1.9 degrees, the world's food baskets fail. 4 degrees, it's insane. Rather than saying we're going to create a plan for how we're going to have a Marshall Plan type mobilization for staying below 1.5 degrees, what we just give up and write is completely mad. So I think sometimes we see the word resilience. How do we design resilience to 4 degrees? You can't. But actually, there was a really great study that was done, a book by Eric Klinenberg, that looked at a heat wave that happened in Chicago in 1995. Where 739 people died in this heat wave. It lasted for a week. For the last 2 days, the power grid went down, so people had no cooling. And what they found in the research was that it wasn't so much whether you lived in an affluent neighborhood or a poor neighborhood. They said that it was people-led, had isolated, lonely, and painful deaths, and that actually it was much more to do with the lack of community connections than anything else. The lack of institutions that bound people together, the churches, the social clubs, all those things. And in some communities, they just didn't have those, and they could be rich or they could be poor. And Transition Network was one of the organizations who contributed to the European Economic and Social Council's opinion on the Climate Pact, the EU Climate Pact, where we said you can't deliver the EU Climate Pact without communities being on board, and also you can't expect communities to just magically do all of this stuff as volunteers in their spare time after they've put the kids to bed. Actually, this needs to be properly resourced, and communities and the kind of the community economy needs to be a really, really vital part of that, I think. So, you know, we saw as well, there was a town in I think in Christchurch in New Zealand, when they had the big earthquake. The transition movement there had created a whole time bank system that was running very successfully. And so when the first responders arrived there, they were able to use the networks that had been created for the time bank in order to contact people very quickly. So we see again and again, we saw in the transition movement in many towns who had run a program called Transition Streets, which is a street-by-street behavior change model that we created, that those were the networks that when COVID arrived, that was how people organized and supported each other. So creating those networks, those relationships between people is absolutely fundamental to resilience.
Okay, so what's the word? Bounce back ability?
Yeah.
Is that the word? Okay, the new word. Bounce back ability might be the buzzword, the new word. In fact, it's actually more about that connectivity, those networks. And in fact, when we actually look at the natural system, resilience, the natural systems, it's the connectedness of trees and fungi. And the example you gave in Chicago, the heat wave, there are other examples from, say, COVID or even Ukraine. It was the natural connectedness of people, those networks that already existed, that were often the first responders to come in. So communities are active and evolving in cities in many, many different ways. Let's talk about a few of them. Let's talk about sort of local currencies, for example. That's one of the things in way people are coming together, communities are coming together and creating things. You've got some examples of where it's working and why it's working and when it's not working. Why?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting is often how an idea starts in one place and it travels and it changes and it spreads. So we started a local currency in my town in 2008 called the Totnes Pound, where we just thought, what would happen if we just printed our own money? Would the Queen come round and personally drag us off to some special room in the Tower of London and throw the key in the River Thames? And it didn't happen. And it was a scheme that actually ran for 11 years. And we were very proud of being a town that had a £21 note, because when people would come round, we could, why have you got a £21 note? Well, why not? And so then there was the Bristol pound. There were about 6 local currencies in the UK. Most of them don't really exist anymore because people just stopped using cash. Just of any kind, cash just disappeared. So when we decided to wind up the Totnes Pound, we did an event that was called A Celebration of the Life and Times of the Totnes Pound, and a real exploration about, well, did it fail? Actually, I think it's been amazing. What an incredible thing it's been. But what's interesting is that that model has now traveled to other places, and particularly here in France. I think there's about 82 different local currency schemes in France, and they have a different model. They took the Totnes model and they developed it. They worked with the Nef Bank, and then the Nef Bank, so the money, when people buy local currency into circulation, that money that then goes into the account in the Nef Bank is then lent back to businesses in that town. So there's a double benefit.
Wow. Everyone likes that the money stays in the town.
Thank you very much.
Thanks
so
for that.
Is that when you make an interesting point? Thank you very much. So in France, there's about 82 of them. And what's lovely is that they've taken that playful thing around denominations. So I went to one place that had a 54 note, somewhere else that had in the La Roue in the Grand Avignon region, they have a 13 note. And in Liège in Belgium, they have a 0 note. I said, why would you have a 0 note? And they said, well, sometimes someone does something nice and you want to say thank you, but you don't want to attach a number to it. You just want like a token of your gratitude, and that's really lovely. But actually, what was interesting after COVID was in the Grand Avignon region, the municipality there wrote the local currency into their economic regeneration strategy. It was one of the key 15 parts of their bounce back approach was, and they promoted it on bus stops, and they said for every 10 that you buy, we'll add 2. So they were really trying to incentivize people. And in Charleroi, in Belgium, the municipality bought 2 million euros of the local currency and distributed it to local people to say, spend this back into the economy. So it's still kind of an evolving model, but that's the thing that I love about it. It's like, I don't know how to do it, and everybody's trying.
Well, this is a great example, I think, of citizens and citizen-led initiatives. Maybe you think at the beginning they're a little bit crazy, they're a little bit bonkers, but they do actually keep the community together. They create connectivity, keep the economy going also, and then when they're built into the actual municipality systems in this way, that's another way of tying everyone together. You've got another example, I think, to do with food systems, no?
Yeah, well, there's a few. I mean, to talk about Liège again, I talk about Liège quite a lot, because they have a system there which is called the Liège Food Belt, Ceinture Alimentaire Liégeoise, he said with a very bad French accent, which is a project that started with Liège en Transition in 2014, and by 2018 they had already raised 5 million euros of investment from the people of the city, not from the bank or the municipality. They started 27 cooperatives. They had a farm, 2 vineyards, a brewery, shops in the center of the city, distribution. Now they're up to something, now they're working very closely with the municipality. What was interesting was the municipality spent the first 3 years thinking, these people are mad, this is never going to work. And then they went to them and said, this is fabulous, how can we help? And so now they're really, they're now using Ceinture Alimentaire as the model for how the cities, for how the universities, the hospitals, the schools procure their food. They're building a whole new kind of infrastructure there, which has now spread to 6 other cities in Belgium as well. I always say when I go there, this is not a good time to buy shares in Sodexo, because actually this is really the model that is going to replace that. It's the model. It was kind of becoming a new normal, I think, in a really delightful way. And just in December, the mayor of Liège made me an honorary citizen of Liège, because he said before this everybody thought Liège was a bit rubbish, really, and actually now everybody says, oh, and Liège is really cool, and you're like an ambassador of Liège, and you go around telling everyone how great Liège is. And I gave me this medal, and I said, thank you very much, that's very kind. Could I have my European citizenship back as well? He said, Mr. Hopkins, that is beyond my powers, I'm afraid. So,
well, I give you 11 out of 10 for trying.
I have to try.
You have to
try, right?
But I want to come back to what you were just evoking, in fact, which is the economic models and some of these new practices. What happens and what new economic models start to emerge when you put communities at the center? We were talking earlier about, I think, a brownfield site that you mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, that idea that you mentioned about how in an ecosystem it's the connections between the different bits is what gives it its resilience. And when you look at a forest, the way that a forest circulates nutrients and water is really sophisticated, and the idea is to keep it circulating as many times in the forest before it leaves. If you allowed a neoliberal economist to design a forest, you would have guttering all around the tree, and as soon as a raindrop landed on a tree, it would be taken off into a big tank owned by one person, and that would be that. So the idea is that we really want money to stay and circulate. That's the idea of a local currency. If you have a Paris local currency, you take it to Lille, it's not worth anything at all. It stays locally, which is why the Bristol pound had very small writing on it which said, keeping money out of the Cayman Islands since 2012, which I just thought was beautiful. So we have a project in my town where the community is working to become its own developer. Usually development is something done by a big private company. It's something done to a community rather than done by a company. And the benefits from it usually stay in private hands. We have next to the train station in my town a big 3-hectare former industrial site, used to be a milk factory. Community has been campaigning for years to become the developer of that site, and it's a long story that I won't go into now, but what underpins it is a different economic model. So the model is, as a community, we've already designed this in a town of 9,000 people. We did a consultation that heard from more than 4,000 people what they wanted to happen on that site. They designed something based on what the community needs, as in truly affordable housing, space for work, a whole range of different things like that. Then we borrow money from pension companies over a longer period of time, over maybe 30 years, and you pay that money back. Every element of the scheme is generating rent to pay it back. It means that when it's finished and when it's built, you've got a development that is generating £2-3 million every year for the community to decide what it wants to do with, because it's in community ownership, right? I keep saying to people, you see those houses over there that were built 30 years ago? Imagine if they were built like that. And this town now every year had £2 or £3 million to decide what it wanted to do with. So I think communities with the right support and with the right professional help can become their own developers, their own community energy companies, their own cooperatives to provide services to hospitals and schools and stuff. And when we do that, we create a very different economy where money stays locally, and as people, we're much, much more in charge of our destiny and what we do.
Rob, you've shared with us also already many great examples of community and citizen-led, very creative examples to help resilience, but also the economy. How transferable and replicable are these examples? What are some of the barriers and the challenges when it comes to actually putting these into place in different places?
Well, I don't know. I mean, well, as anybody who came to my session yesterday will know, I think one of the barriers is that there is a profound lack of imagination in many places. And I think that a lot of our work is around the kind of storytelling that's needed to unlock. I quoted Don DeLillo, who said, longing on a large scale is what makes history. And I feel like actually we need to, as local representatives and people working in different ways, to become better at that kind of storytelling. I loved when Anne Hidalgo ran to be re-elected in Paris, and she was talking about the idea of the 15-minute city. She gave this beautiful speech that was, it's 2030, we're living in a 15-minute city. So she projected herself forward into that future and spoke from a 15-minute city. And I think in that way we can cultivate longing in really great ways. I think some of the barriers are, I'm a great critic of this concept of net zero by 2050. Governments keep talking about net zero by 2050. Net zero by 2050 is a political target, it's not a scientific target. And it's so far out that people go, oh, it's 2050, that's ages away. There's no urgency in 2050. So, and we were just in the donut economics workshop downstairs, and what I think donut economics does so beautifully is to say, okay, we need to work within this space. And what I've learned about imagination most is that the imagination needs limits. When we put limits around the imagination, people are so much more creative. And in all the work that I've done and I've seen donut economics do, actually bringing the target further forward and being more ambitious unlocks much more creativity. Otherwise, we just get stuck in kind of electric vehicles and solar panels, which is really important, but it goes much deeper than that, I think, into food systems, into ownership, into very different kind of approaches. And I think donut economics is beautiful at identifying what that sweet spot is. I think also we have a huge skills gap in terms of the stuff that we need to do. I quite often talk about what I call the great reskilling, which is that if we're going to do everything that we need to do in the next 10 or 15 years, we need to be training up people. We need many people who are brilliant community facilitators. We need people who can grow food in different situations, people who can insulate houses on a huge, huge scale. You know, how do we do that? How do we fill that skills gap? Because we need to do that really urgently too.
Definitely. So education, filling the skills gap. In fact, we've heard that on many of the panels and many stages over the course of the last couple of days. I like what you say about the storytelling and sort of imagining that future. It goes back to what Thierry was saying on the panel that started out this session, think big. You know, one of my favorite engineers, Britta in Isambard Kingdom Brunel, was out there imagining all these crazy things, but by imagining further, we were able to go a little bit further faster because the horizon was a bit further away. So storytelling, thinking big. Rob, it's been an absolute pleasure having you with us, sharing all these examples of how citizens and communities can help build resilience and sustainable cities. Thanks so much for joining us here today at ChangeNOW.
Thank you.